how Sylvia wants to play this.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the closing plenary, questions and research directions in communication studies and global human rights. I wanted to thank you for being here at the very end of the conference, and also thanking the co-chairs of the Conference Theme Committee for their work, for reviewing submissions, and of course for being here at this panel. I will ask them to introduce themselves briefly, but I wanted to recognize them first. Professor Tanya Bosch, Professor Pradeep Thomas, Professor Ella McPherson, Professor John Henry, and Professor Gerard Gauguin. Also want to acknowledge that Professor Carrie Anden Papadopoulos was part of the committee. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us. And also I wanted to acknowledge the late Carrie Moore, who, even though she was sick when I contacted her to be part of this, she nevertheless accepted to be part of that. And unfortunately, we lost her a few months ago. Please join me in a moment of reflection in remembrance of Carrie. Thank you. So what we're going to do today is have a conversation, an informal conversation. I will ask my colleagues to get a sense of what they heard at the conference, what are exciting, interesting lines of research around communication and human rights. My goal, which I shared with the co-chairs several months ago by selecting the theme of communication and global human rights, is to basically showcase the range of research in our association and our discipline around these issues. So first of all, I would like, if you can introduce yourself a minute or two, and you can say a few things about the work that you have done on this issue. Tanya, we're going to go first.
You want us also to reflect our reflections?
Just one or two, first of all, about you, and then we open it up. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Bosch. I'm based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And the area I work in, which has been really pertinent to a lot of themes emerging in this conference, is social media, activism and identity, not only in a global South African context, but also further afield.
Hi, my name is Pradeep Thomas. I'm from the University of Queensland. I've been working in this area of human rights and communications for quite a long time, especially in the area of communication rights. And I teach in the area of social change, communication social change, and also do a lot of work on India media and religion in the media. All these areas where this theme is really pertinent, so thank you.
I'm Ella McPherson. I'm a sociologist, and I've work on human rights fact-finding in the digital age, thinking about how the human rights community is reacting to digital fakery and how that has implications for thinking about who's in our democratic public sphere. I'm also really interested in people who are rejecting, breaking, and refusing technology. So examples of neolitism in the UK, and also starting to think more about ChatGPT and other generative AI.
Good afternoon, John Rooney from Hong Kong. I've been working on human rights and social justice issues for a long time. The first big project I did many years ago was around HIV and AIDS. So critical cultural politics of health has always been something that I worked on. And then I decided that, at some point I should really know more about human rights law. So I went to law school. And it's a crazy place. I don't recommend it. And so my current work, since I completed law studies, has always been trying to bring closer the kind of cultural analytical lens, communication theories, but also legal theories into the mix to study. My latest project is on human rights museums.
I'm Gerard Gauguin. I'm from Western Sydney University. I just wanted to firstly acknowledge the
Yungaburra and Cumbri people, did the traditional custodians of the land where we're on today, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I work on Gadigal lands at Western Sydney and Western Sydney University, and live and work in Sydney. And my work has been since the 1990s, when I worked for an NGO around access to communications technologies and communications rights. And when I moved into academia, one of the things that I worked with, collaborations I'd had with the NGO were around with the disability movement. And so I've worked now probably for 3 decades or so with a whole bunch of researchers, activists and others around disability and essentially communications rights, which is an incredibly interesting area.
Thank you. So my first question, and probably we can start again with Tanya, is what is it that you heard in the last days of the conference that you found sort of interesting, surprising, exciting around the issues of communication and human rights?
I think so many things stand out for me, Sylvia, but what I really would like to talk about is decoloniality. There are 2 things I want to talk about: the concept of the Global South, and maybe I'll come to that a bit later, but perhaps I'll just start with this idea of decoloniality, which seems to have been a thread running throughout and very much connected to this concept of human rights, which has been the theme of the conference. I think there's always the risk that decoloniality becomes a kind of buzzword, I think that what really emerged for me out of the conversations at this conference was the idea that we should be careful of not simply performing decoloniality. We need to engage in a kind of decolonial self-reflexivity, which can be very uncomfortable. Those of us who describe ourselves as being decolonial scholars or supporters of decoloniality often also benefit and sustain it through our own complicity with coloniality. I think we need to interrogate our own positionality and scholarship in relation to coloniality. Are we decolonizing, or are we simply performing decoloniality? Very quickly to tie this back to something that emerged at the very beginning of the conference. So at the opening plenary, for those who were there was this question that the statement and question, colonization does not end. How do we hold our institutions accountable? And in the conversations over the last few days, that question became really quite stark for me. In thinking that perhaps we need to explore more radical solutions beyond the university to achieve social justice in the kind of ways that we purport to, in other words, effecting real change as scholars and not only using this concept as a buzzword.
Thank you. Good.
Yeah, I think it's extraordinary that the first panel actually set the scene. And in many of the sessions that I attended, it was pretty clear that, in the various disciplinary areas, they were actually dealing with human rights, right? Which is great, in the environment, in health, and so on and so forth. For me, and I'm intrigued by the fact that at this conference, we also dealt with, old issues such as media ownership, right, as a human right, right, from a human rights perspective. And it's fascinating that these types of issues still remain, right? But at the same time, I think, we need to think of, both these large issues related to media ownership and people like Rupert Murdoch and what they've done to the media and all that kind of stuff, but also the smaller issues related to communications, the kind of deficits there are at a local level, the kinds of things that they face at a local level. So, for example, in the area of health, the voices of local people, right, who determine what human rights is, what health for all is, kind of thing. And so that, both the macro level and the micro level in terms of human rights is what, that's one of my takeaways from this.
Thank you. We're going to continue. We're going to come back to both of you. Ella?
Thank you. I have a couple of really inspiring, many really inspiring moments. Thank you all for making such a wonderful conference. I learned a lot, and I was really heartened by all of our kind of, communal quests to understand the world better and to make the world better with our research. So I think I agree with you that I was reminded of some of our core approaches in media and communication. So I went to this brilliant documentary a couple nights ago, which was called Beyond the Straight and Narrow, and it was about queer and trans TV in the age of streaming. And I was really reminded, we know that representation and visibility really matter when we're talking about human rights and all kinds of other important issues. And that documentary really reminded me how important materiality and the political economy of media are in shaping who is visible and how. Another area which we heard a lot about is generative AI. And, we learned a lot about how it's challenging so many things in our areas, from thinking about how digital fakery is challenging human rights fact-finding, to how it's changing relationships between news outlets and their audiences through, say, trust and bylines, to our scholarship practices ourselves. So mostly I find it doesn't align, generative AI does not align with our human rights and our scholarship values. And the hype around it really eclipses our ability to pursue those values. But I learned something really wonderful last night, which was it's possible that generative AI is just a bubble, right? It's just hype, and it's not actually our future. Just two other points, very small points, but big points. So I learned, or I was reminded, how important it is to study the people we disagree with, even though it's distressing and difficult. And I went to a panel on feminist discourse and counter-discourse yesterday, and I was reminded how important it is to understand those that you disagree with in order to both understand the issue better, but also to think about, if you're going to act politically, what are you acting in reaction to or against? And then finally, at the meta level, that scholarship on communication and human rights is also about our human rights as scholars, our freedoms of expression, assembly, association, opinion, our right to privacy. These are also under threat. And I echo the call made in the Scholars at Risk panel yesterday that ICA can be a source of protection for those rights. It can be a network. It can be a witness to our struggles in this space. So,
oh, thank you. John?
Well, I'd like to consider that, I'm pretty in tune with a certain paradigmatic tendencies in human rights studies in general, whether it's coming from political science, international studies, or legal studies, or, the kind of intervention I've tried to make is from the kind of cultural critical lens. And within that paradigm, one of the major framing tendencies in human rights studies is a certain bifurcation between liberal democratic political systems and media systems, and more so-called authoritarian political and media systems. So the observation I'd like to offer you, from having gone to a number of these human rights sessions in ICA this year, is that I'm seeing the same bifurcation. There are panels, brilliant scholars, very interesting projects, but if they're working in the liberal democratic context, the concerns are about self-determination, the concerns are about the enumeration of rights that are under threat, the concerns are about DEI priorities, very familiar in a kind of liberal democratic contexts. And the other set of papers that are from so-called authoritarian countries, majority of them are from China with some interesting reason at ICA. The list of concerns are quite familiar as well. Censorship, political repression, et cetera, But, I'd like to say that in global human rights studies, comparison or comparative methodologies are primary, are very fundamental to any kind of meaningful human rights analysis. And I think that scholars who work in their own respective contexts might want to think about comparing those things. Besides, there are degrees of authoritarianism and degrees of liberalism in the world, as we're seeing in countries that are moving far right, etc. So you see, these tendencies are not binaristic. And so the kind of human rights analyses, whatever projects that scholars engage in, might benefit from more cross-pollination, I suppose, across, I don't think it's global north, global south division, but you know the kind of bifurcation I'm trying to point out. So that's the one observation which I deeply appreciate in a lot of the excellent work, but I also see that reproduction of that tendency.
Thank you. George?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed this conference in so many ways, and particularly the thematic of human rights. And it's been just lovely, I think, from this place, at least Australia or this region, to see the ways it's been framed and the courtesy, I think, and the generosity from the opening panel. And I felt that was an important centering, and that the president of the Human Rights Commission, Professor Croucher, made reference to a number of important developments in disability in Australia. And I think I just want to talk just a moment about that, because I think it's been a really interesting and problematic place for that. But there's been a Disability Royal Commission into Violence and Abuse Against People with Disability in Australia that's recently concluded. There's a National Disability Insurance Scheme that's been folding out. There's a lively public sphere around disability in Australia. Some of that really, particularly the latter, has really to do with communication. And I think that is incredibly interesting and important, and that I think in the Australian context, that has been something that, for various accidental reasons, people have worked on, and the sense of that. And I think that I was a little in the bubble of perhaps a disability moment at ICA. It's even for a big conference, and coming from places where some disability media studies was done, for a long time it's been pretty marginal. And I think in this conference we had a pre-con with 75 abstracts presented. We had a series of panels. We invited local colleagues from Griffith to talk about this. And I think one of the things emerged about that was this sort of sense in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, 2006, has a really interesting reframing of the idea of communications rights. In a project some of us were involved with Nick Coldry and others, the International Panel of Social Progress, we saw disability as a cross-cutting case, right, around this. And I felt in this conference, it sort of in some ways came home to roost. And it was in some ways courtesy of a group of 7 or 8 people that we'd had involved, Katie Ellis from Australia, Victor Schwang from Singapore, colleagues from Latin America. But what was really interesting, I thought, was the sense that communications rights, particularly when you think around the diversities of disability, is very multimodal, it's very multilingual. But there are all sorts of challenges when you think about voice, when you think about listening, and the Australian colleagues just did a panel on the voice referendum in Australia, the failure of the Indigenous, an initiative about the voice to Parliament. But that expression in a broader sense was, and we had an emerging scholar who gave a presentation via their augmented alternative communication device about this, just making the point that a lot of new technologies, emerging technologies, might use face recognition, which comes from problematic contexts. But if your body or your identities or other doesn't fit that, it's very hard to authenticate yourself, right? To be a citizen in the digital society. And I felt in this, what really gave me some heart was that in our activity a bit, as Tanya and others are making the point, there was a sense in which the sharp edge, some of the tough questions around decolonising approaches were there. We had colleagues from African contexts, Latin American contexts, from Asian contexts, from other contexts. It's an area that's been dominated, albeit fairly marginal, by North American, European, Australian approaches. And I think what was really fascinating in ICA was that this is coming alive, but in this other sense, in some of the transversal senses that you're talking about, John, as well.
Thank you. Any reactions to what we just heard in the last round?
Yeah, it struck me, the comment about AI. I think everything at this conference has been very much centered around the digital, even the smooth tech, setup that we're experiencing right now and that we've experienced in every session. And what just occurs to me is that the majority of the world is not perpetually connected. There are all these moral panics and this hyper focus on AI, But we also need to not forget about the role of legacy media, the role of, community radio, television news. It is in some ways a kind of bubble, the sparkles bubble that Jean talked about in the internet, Steve Jones' internet lecture.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? I have questions, so but I want to hear if you have any reactions to what we just heard.
Anything?
All right, so
digital.
I want to ask the question the following way. Did you hear anything provocative or something that you would like to make a provocation to think about sort of new ways about communication, human rights, and sort of this wide range of issues?
Not that I heard about it, but I think, all these terms that we use, even human rights, the global north, global south, all these types of terms need to be kind of interrogated. Because some of these things don't make any sense anymore because of the fact that, even human rights, right? You're in a situation of where most of us are living in these illiberal democracies, where majorities now define what human rights are, right? It's for them.
But is it because of what John said earlier about the problems of binary sort of conceptualizations or way of thinking about this that
Could well be.
they could be as helpful as, but also in ways of orienting our attention in ways that don't allow us to see the complexity or the diversity beyond those 2 or 3 concepts?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, organizations like ICA have a responsibility in some ways, kind of to explore these things further, right? So that there's more clarity with respect to what we're talking about. Yeah? We invoke this all the time, but what do we mean by this in the context of these illiberal scenarios that we live in?
Right. But if I heard John correctly, you're talking about that the binary doesn't allow us sort of a gradation, especially when we talk about human rights, rather than a stark opposition between at least these 2 terms, in abstract, as well as how they worked out in reality in different countries. Especially when we talk about a range of human rights, right? That is, maybe that's not the right way of sort of conceptualizing or situating the analysis. I think, John.
No, absolutely. I think what I'm trying to point out is that, of course, when one works in one's own context, and those are the urgent kind of human rights questions or the human rights violations that you're working on, then you frame it that way. So if you work in the US, those are some of the primary tendencies that you want to look at, take DEI priorities being one example. If you work in the kind of more post-colonial or decolonial context or global south, then questions about censorship and repression come to mind. I think that's natural. One thing I'd like to offer is that, I think communication and the law discipline can join hands more often for the following reason. Because the legal methodologies, often by deploying comparative legal pluralistic analyses, could offer more granulated analysis of human rights problems, often drawing on references from other national and political contexts. That's a basic requirement in legal analysis, the better ones. And so I think that those methodologies might help. Now, just one example. I went to a what's the division? There's a law division, communication law and
Law and policies.
Policy division. It was a spectacular session that I went to, in which the question of proportionality being one of the central legal principles in free speech laws were robustly debated. And when that tool was being offered in the room to talk about it, you can see, light bulbs are coming on. And I think it's not a panacea. I don't want to say that, but it's one very useful tool that communication scholars could work on. And besides, you do have that division. But I think that I'm worried about the fact that the more that we reproduce the set issues in set political contexts, then we may be blindsided by what is really going on. I mean, when I say there are degrees of authoritarianism, I'm thinking about the US, right? So there are all sorts of things that are changing under our feet. And then human rights violations are taking different forms because there are different gradations of authoritarian / liberal / a-liberal kind of political structures coming on.
Yes, yeah, I absolutely agree with these points, and I think it's actually you're actually calling us to the table methodologically, right? So this is a methodological call to go out and get our hands in the dirt and like figure out what is going on the ground rather than working with our own presumptions. And I want to just talk a little bit more about this connection between, say, media and communications and law. I think it's this kind of, I agree with you, it's a productive site because I imagine, and you can tell us because you have a law degree, but on the law side, engaging with critical approaches in the social sciences makes space for reflection that may not otherwise be there. And conversely, having to engage with laws and norms allows the media and communication scholar to perhaps think about how to action their research and how to connect with sort of broader worlds.
Yeah. So it's more than methods. It's about actionability.
Yeah.
I mean,
let me raise another point.
Well, just to briefly loop on that, because we had a great paper from Lorenzo Dalvit from Rhodes University from Makanda in South Africa about enforceability, that I think he was putting in a way that it's, in one sense, seems obvious, but saying, look, whole parts of the world don't have an enforceability around, say, disability human rights. We don't know about that. And that seemed to me to be a really kind of useful thing to be thinking through. And that in some ways around, I think, disability human rights, there's been a smallish community where perforce people have had to work across to some extent law, media, sociology, and other kinds of reasons. But I think these broader issues about how you think about some of the maybe key frameworks and concepts of human rights and think across different sites is incredibly important. So really, I think it very much is the case if you're thinking in particular around, say, communication and disability and human rights, that's often just focused on, say, narrow digital inclusion, right? But thinking through broader aspects. And then I suppose the other thing I was thinking about as well is about having recently, worked in a country where human rights wasn't part of a certain discourse, as it says in an Australian context, having to work more with terms like social inclusion. How do you keep the work going and conceptualizations of rights and being able to articulate that, but also have practical kind of purchase and work in different horizons? And what your phrase, Silvio, at the outset about normative horizons, what do they look like, right? Because one of the issues is in the achievement of certain sorts of rights and in their codification in law. Some of those have been problematic, right? Yep. The ways they're encoded. They certainly have around the disability human rights conventions.
So let me throw this question. So the issue of backlash has been sort of central to recent research around human rights, particularly around communication, human rights, and in some ways fits sort of a narrative that for the last 50 years, particularly if you look at the global experience, but particularly in certain countries, sort of an advances around human rights issues that sort of being challenged right now. I would like to unpack this, whether or not that narrative is right, whether on the issues that you work on, can you talk about a backlash? What does it mean, a backlash? Is that a sort of a linear narrative, or is part of sort of ebb and flow of ideas and movements around this? Any thoughts on this? I mean, is that what's happening? I mean, or that's sort of a limited way of understanding the current moment globally?
I think that backlash has always been there. I mean, ever since the McBride report and communication rights, people involved in social change and social justice have had to deal with that backlash, right? The McBride report famously talked about the need to get a level playing field when it came to media ownership and structures and institutions and all that kind of stuff. And it was immediately shot down by the powers that be, right? And I don't think, that battle is still here. I mean, it's only got, there have been ebbs and flows, There have been times when these types of battles have been in the forefront, like at the World Summit on the Information Society. And then, that's the kind of, so everybody comes together, civil society organizations come together to discuss these issues and make a stance. And then, and it disappears, right? But it's always there, it's ever present. I mean, look at this state of our media today. Media concentration in different parts of the world. It's only got worse. It hasn't got any better. So I think the challenge is for us to kind of keep dealing with this, right? You can't, you can't say that these are old issues. These are persistent issues. So how do you deal with, these kinds of deficits as a persistent issue, right? Changing in the context of social media, the digital, and all the rest of it.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I think backlash is such an important part of this dynamic, and I think it's. I think we can all recognize that it's in a particularly acute state right now. But I think one of the things that's very useful, that remains useful about the concept of backlash, I think, is naming a backlash, because in a way, when you name a backlash, you are almost denaturalizing it. So not saying, okay, well, that's an argument that might hold water. You're saying, oh, you're having a reaction to an idea that we had that's good, right? So it's showing that the initial idea that's having the backlash against it has created a reaction. But I do think, in terms of our scholarship, that we need to have sort of differentiation within the backlashes, because I think we have all these different kinds going on right now. And so you mentioned moral panic, and I think that there's a kind of moral panic idea about people gaining rights, right, through tech or data or whatever it is. But there's also, you have visibility backlashes, pushing back against, again, people gaining their rights. You have epistemology backlashes where people are saying, actually, we can't have these ways of knowing because they, maybe even within the human rights community, because they threaten our ability to prove facticity if you bring fiction into the mix, right? So there's all these different kinds of backlashes, and so it's a politically helpful concept, but I think we do need to, as we go forward, have ways of differentiating and sort of narrowing our kind of focal analysis on what kinds of backlashes are happening.
I think if you study human rights, you have to do backlash studies. Because such a constitutive feature of the world of human rights, whether you're working as lawyers or activists or civic groups. So backlash is absolutely a key question. But I cannot agree more with Ella. There are different kinds of backlashes from within and from without the community. Sometimes from the very communities that human rights are supposed to protect. To give you an example about, many of you know that Thailand, after Taiwan, is becoming the second Asian country to allow gay marriage legally, all this stuff. But if you are on the ground working with the NGO groups and activist groups, how many queer people and communities are being sidelined by that law? That's supposed progressive law, the most progressive law in the world, in the world of Asia. So there are there's homonationalism, there's all kinds of tendencies that are exclusionary, even in the name of protection of human. So I don't know if that's backlash, but there are all kinds of push and pull, even within the communities itself, let alone from kind of political actors of the government and whatnot. So backlash studies, we should have a panel on that.
Let me raise another question around, just follow up on what John has said. So recently, the last decades, we have heard that sort of a reaction against different human rights movements or advances in the name of fending off, let's say, universal expansionism or Western ideology or, something like that, or that kind of sort of couching that kind of language, right, as a way of defending cultural uniqueness of the nation, etc. And at the same time, there has been this long sort of standing criticism of human rights as being a universalistic project, and as such is suspicious because it overrides, if else, to recognize cultural difference. So at the current moment, one is a more philosophical argument, the other is a much more political argument in terms of understanding that, these ideas, human rights broadly defined, are not ours, and the pretense that they are everyone's, that's that's wrong, that is something fishy or suspicious or sort of something to be criticized. Thoughts on that? I mean, because we hear that sort of discourse, sort of informing the backlash or being used as a way to justify that in different parts around the world.
Yeah. I can have a quick
Yes.
go.
Okay.
I think you're right, because in the context of, again, of these illiberal democracies, in the context of religious nationalism, this is a reality today, right? That there is a kind of a backlash against universal human rights. Okay? So in the context of India, for example, that I'm familiar with, that backlash is in the context of a resurgence of, say, old identities like caste, right? Which is, a hierarchical system. So when you have a hierarchical system, it's not everybody who's got human rights. Some people will be more equal than others, right? How does one deal with that in this particular context? When there's been a resurgence, they're very strong, they're pushing that ideology down the throats of everybody. And also minorities like Muslims, right? In the context of India, who are being denied their rights, right? Their human rights in so many different ways. So I think this is again an area that needs to be, we have to, this is why I say that we need to actually interrogate human rights again. Right? And it's these kinds of spaces like the ICA that can do it so well. Right? And so we've got to go back to the basics because of the fact that there is that backlash, right, in these different contexts.
Yeah, Ella?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mel.
Yes. It was making me think of the work of one of my colleagues, Sebastian Lehuede, who looks at how indigenous communities who don't like the language of digital rights, say, will use that language strategically because they know that the kind of global north will pay attention to them, right? So I think that's a kind of methodological grassroots way of thinking, how are communities themselves navigating this language and these norms and laws? I think it's a question for us also as scholars, and I've definitely been asked this before, I'm sure you all have as well, which is that, if a human rights project is flawed, because of course it has power in it, and it is, the kind of language is a Western language, how do you feel as a scholar, right? Like, how can you work with that? And I think my answer to that has been, well, I'm going to take a, approach through the lens of pragmatism, which is that, in my view, it's sort of one of the best things we have in terms of preventing abuses and redressing other kinds of power imbalances. But I can still recognize that it has its flaws. So there's my ideal version, and there's my kind of pragmatic version of.
And the flaws being sort of the philosophical underpinnings of it, the assumptions. I mean,
the way that it's
the history. I mean, the project as a whole. I mean, what?
The way that it's been mobilized for. Invasions and actions and all kinds of things. I mean, that's hugely problematic to me, right? But that's not the kind of human rights I'm defending.
Right.
Okay.
John?
So about universal or global, I'm a bit of a sucker for global norms of human rights, because philosophically and ethically, we need to draw lines. I'm sorry. As post-structuralists as we want to be, there are basic human decency and dignity that you just do not violate. And if you see violence, whether it's culturally specific violence or universalistic violence, is still violence. So there's something attractive about that normative language, however problematic it may be. And one of the most problematic places in which it crops up is precisely what Ella talks about, is that states, in the name of human rights, engage in war, militarism, and all kinds of environmental destructions, and because it's they use that as in a universalistic language. We need to be mindful of that, but that does not mean that cultural relativism is the answer, right? Because I think there is something, like I said, there needs to be some lines drawn, and the more kind of impossible violations and violence that we're witnessing in the world today, the more we need to be clear about where those lines are. I think that's where the so-called universal norms can come and help us at least start the conversation there. And if you want to challenge those, where those lines are drawn, where those norms are drawn, then we have a place to start and,
Right.
and be able to clarify your different political positions around it.
Yeah, I mean, to just add to that, I think I'm attracted to that as well, right? But that at the philosophical level as well, perhaps it is about understanding, keeping the theory going, the critique, the rethinking, the reimagining about the human aspect, right? Because there's been a lot of discussion about the more than human, then there's the less than human that's not been taken account of in human rights. And it seems to me that's incredibly useful at the philosophical level, right? Thinking through environment, other species. In disability, that's very much the case about what's been less than human, thinking through at that level. And then perhaps that's sort of the practical action-oriented, or seeing in some ways the field of human rights politically is, what are those fights that we heard from the opening panel, right? The struggles around human rights. How human rights is being construed? What are the interests at play in human rights? And what are the trade-offs across different kinds of rights, a classical approach? And what's that interaction between concepts of what might be rights and justice and inequalities, right? There's sort of slightly different things that people are, yes, sometimes skeptical of rights talk. I found it incredibly important, and even in trying to marshal, say, some of the concepts around disability human rights in different concepts. People say, well, it's very lofty, happening at the UN level, and you read the reports and it seems a little bit abstract, but that's still incredibly useful in terms of something that's there that you can start to reimagine and to work with as well.
Okay, I think I would like to go now to the public and see if you have any questions, any issue you would like to bring up.
Thank you for your reflection. As a follow-up to the last discussion we were having, I agree, John, with the idea to preserve the global norm of human rights, but I wonder what has been often discussed and contested about human rights in the conception of the human in human rights, right? Whether we think about Hannah Arendt criticism, whether we think about Bonaventura de Souza Santos, who talks about human rights as a hegemonic discourse, the challenge seems to be that the construction of the human has long rested on processes of dehumanization and constructions of the dehumanized others. So when we're thinking about human rights moving forward, do we need, how if at all, I guess I should ask, we need to pay attention to focusing more on the human in our discussion of human rights? And how do we get past these processes that keep dividing us both within the West and, vis-a-vis others in the world? Thank you.
Any
Suggestion.
any thoughts on?
Well, every now and then, the longer the history of human rights philosophy and discourse progresses, at different junctures, we often come back to this very important question about recentering the human. And this is the juncture, right? Isn't it? Isn't this the juncture where all sorts of digital AI, mechanistic, technological imperatives are transforming the way we conduct our relationship with each other? The status of the human is a bit of a crisis. But I mean, that is the bottom line, but how do we do it? And how do we do it in a way that is not creating resistance to the digital onslaught of everyday life, while still being able to talk to each other as human beings? Is one of the conversations that I think we should be having. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for everybody's contributions. To my mind, mental wellness and so-called invisible disabilities go hand in hand with our human rights as scholars not to publish and perish, as Professor Hanich, the study that was published recently about the actual dangerous state of the mental wellness of communication scholars. And this is especially true for what Professor Bosch this morning called majority world countries. this pressure to publish and perish given the demands of international publication. So my question is actually more of a call to arms to pay more attention to connection and mentorship, to support across different types of boundaries, whether it's invisible disabilities, whether it's different divisions, whether it's different geographical regions. I don't know how to do it. I'm just asking for it to be done. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I completely agree. I think that's an incredibly important point. And maybe some of the point you're making about, and I think the work, right, on trying to draw to light issues of mental health, challenges, the precarity, the sort of, there's a famous book by the US scholar Larry Davis called Enforcing Normalcy, you know, the enforcing normalcy of scholarly life, right, I think is incredibly important, how you draw those connections. I think that body of work is really useful, pulling together across scholarly associations, across contexts, and having that discussion and thinking about what are those practices of mentoring. I think that's where scholarly associations can provide a different kind of space. They can still be an inaccessible, exclusive, oppressive space as well, but they can be spaces where some of those connections and perhaps the sort of conviviality, the tools of conviviality can be brought to bear when people are, you know, at conferences, perhaps outside some of their institutional frameworks as well. Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps just to add quickly, that comment sounds like a challenge to the Denver 2025 committee around looking at ways to disrupt. And just to add very briefly, I think it's interesting that I think our own positionality comes into play. So interesting to hear how some colleagues feel as though there's been a lot of diversity at this conference. And of course, it's always easier to criticize when you're on the outside looking in. But in many ways, as a majority world scholar, I very much also felt the sense that there's a lot of reinscribing of that there has been a lot of also reinscribing of Western centrism in terms of the kind of lens through which we have looked at some of these issues, even when they have pertained to contexts outside of you know, North America, Europe, etc.
I totally sympathize with this. I think, I totally agree. I cannot agree more that, you know, the imperative to publish or perish has to be one of the human rights tragedies in neoliberal universities, mine included, where I work. So I don't know how to deal with that because, you know, that is such an imperative, and people put on that lens when they look at you in that way. And all of us. However, there are some very interesting initiatives going on around, you know, that I know of at least one that in those of you who are European, the European Research Council had adopted what they call the DORA principle. Some of you know this, many of you know this. The DORA principle suggests that in university promotion and recognition of people's grants records and publication records, they don't do metrics. They don't check your H index, they don't check your scopus, whatever. That's the DORA principle that's widely adopted across the European countries, at least through the ERC's work. So there are things going on like that, but you know, I think because I'm an administrator as well, so I plead guilty for that kind of crime. But on the other hand, what I do is, you know, while I encourage colleagues to publish and write for grants and everything, I also do writing retreat. I also form reading groups. I also want to, because I want to recenter the human in the professional context, that we're all humans, that we need intellectual substance and sustenance, and we need to be together in this sort of community, while, yes, we face this sort of tragedy. So no solution, but.
Go ahead. Yes, thank you. We can have the mic there. Or if you want to use, there's someone coming here.
Colleague's going to just sort that.
Thank you. Can we have a sound on
Double jeopardy.
the only mic left? Thank you. It's not on yet? There's a mic coming.
Is this one working?
Yep.
Hey. I was going to say, I promise my question isn't that good. So I'm hearing us talk about global human rights, and I'm sitting here thinking, hey, wait a second. I haven't seen any captions on any of the programming that we've done, any live captions. There's not any CART technology. I'm going to receptions that aren't wheelchair accessible, that are miles away. And I'm a grad student, and I can't afford to do most of these kinds of activities. And so as we are in this lovely space, I'm thinking, how much are we responsible to change this? And especially as many of us are paid for by universities who this past year were suppressing human rights, especially in the form of suppressing protests, right? And we benefit from that, and that the universities continue to exist and can continue to pretend to pay us. How much are we responsible for taking direct action? And what does that direct action look like, right? When do we turn the captions on for our PowerPoints? When do we check to make sure the tables are more than 60 inches apart, right? What does that functionally look like? And what steps do we actively take to make it more accessible to everyone?
I'm happy to. Thank you very much. I mean, you're spot on in terms of that. I think scholarly associations have a way to go, right? I mean, we did it in running the disability sessions. We had CART. We tried to address some of the accessibility issues, working with the ICA colleagues. And one of the interesting challenges was actually getting the systems to work together, captioning, Zoom, what the colleagues are doing here in the conference thing. But I think there is a tendency still, perhaps in the ICA context, I'm on another association, IMCR. We've just set up a disability accessibility task force. It's long overdue, but the mandate is squarely to provide a mechanism to address those issues, to make captioning particularly useful right across multilingual audiences as well, standard to what we do. But you also point to the practices, people just routinely incorporating these practices as well. So I think there's a long way to go. You're absolutely right.
Anything to add? No?
Thank you.
Who's next? Yeah.
I want to take us back to the opening plenary where Dr. Mary Graham talked about obligations rather than rights. And I think so the question I suppose I'm posing is, when are we going to listen to cultures and peoples who have demonstrably shown us that they are able to live in harmony and respect for the earth and the land and for each other, and use their language and their ways? So this is, we persist in using the language of human rights, which comes after the conflagration of the Second World War, which actually was a European fight that drew the rest of the world into it. But we don't, and I see what we do is we say, okay, you can speak your language and you can have your ideas and your cultures and so on, but we don't let them talk back into this space. Because if we started to think carefully about how obligations, human obligations and human land obligations are understood and worked out intellectually, and we allowed that to infuse our understandings and our intellectual positions, we might have a different approach and we might be able to use it differently. So I'm thinking at the moment, that many commentators on the war on Gaza, not the war with Gaza, have commented on how the Israeli government has weaponized humanitarian assistance and the language of human rights and the claims of the moral army. I'm thinking that in certain circumstances like that, the language of obligation rather than the language of right might have more power. And I'm also thinking of the work of James Ferguson, you know, the work on the share. He says we fail, and I'm sort of commenting to the one delegate speaker in that first session who said we need more empathy. James Ferguson would say no, you know, just drumming up empathy is a sort of wasted task, I think. We need more powerful sense of obligation as human beings. So I'm just putting that into the conversation because it's been in my head for the last 5 days. Thank you.
Thank you. Any thoughts on that? No? Yes, go ahead.
Hello there. Thank you very much for all of your contributions so far. This has been very interesting. I wanted to expand a little in the comment that was made around human rights and disability and our ability to participate fully in the conference and things like that. And what jumped into my mind is a wonderful focus that has happened in the recent days on scholars at risk. Having been at risk, I also am very aware of the many, many different forms that takes for different people in different contexts around the world who face very, very different risk factors. And it struck me, you know, through my participation, I felt a little uncomfortable at times when I saw the signs saying that we are under surveillance, our voices as we walk between different parts of the venue, and facial recognition is being used. And I know there are many people in the conference that take critical views on this, but I wanted to say, if we're talking about human rights and scholars at risk and their different abilities to participate and so on, there are people, I mean, I live in a Western democracy, so while I feel uncomfortable because I have been subject to hacking and things like this, there are other people, you know, if we're trying to bring people from places like China, where they might perceive, you know, this as saying, well, maybe I can't fully voice what I want to say to my colleagues as I'm walking around the conference. People sort of talk about how they, you know, very personal and private things as I talk about. Not necessarily it's only the talks that we might put out publicly. So I wanted to ask if you had any comments on the sort of internet age human rights around how we build together a community in which we can all participate for, you know, having those kinds of conversations, those ones that we have when we are just mingling, as well as the ones in our presentations. Thank you very much.
Anyone wants to?
I mean, I might just have a brief here. That's a really, I mean, that was a really rich and complex kind of set of meditations in a way and challenges, and there's a lot of complexities to that and important things. I was involved in a project actually in digital rights in Australia and Asia about, 6 or 7 years ago, when we brought people to Sydney, a smaller workshop, but some of those issues were absolutely on point when we brought people from different Asian contexts about how we could have a conversation and do that with people with safety for people who are activists back in their own country. It was a little easier in that context because of a smaller group of people. We were able to contain some of the surveillance architectures, but in a larger conference, I think that's quite challenging. I mean, it's a country here where intelligence agencies are working with respect to international students from particular countries, and that's a feature of everyday life and the institutions as well. So when you overlay across that, holding a conference, and you hold it in a venue such as this, which is large and so on, you're working with some challenging things, and I think that's one of the difficulties for international organisations, but you're absolutely right. Like, how do you foster those conversations? But you're dealing with 3,500 colleagues from many countries in different contexts and doing it here. So anyway, I thought that was incredibly important. I don't have any bright answers on the spot. Thank you.
Thank you. A few things in reaction, probably not as a moderator, but someone who have some thoughts on a few things that were just said by the last 2 or 3 questions. The first one is about whether or not, it's an old debate, whether or not the conventional notion of human rights is incompatible with community rights or community obligations, and whether or not this last issue is sort of a blind spot in the traditional, more orthodox view of human rights as of 1948, given the historical context in which the declaration emerged. I'm of the view that it's not necessarily incompatible philosophically, that there is a compatibility of way of thinking about sort of how individual rights as originally formulated and community obligations or obligations towards others are not incompatible, right? Maybe it is a blind spot, maybe it is a gap, maybe it's a hole. This is a more sort of broader discussion. Second is that, to me, the question of that language, and I said that at the opening plenary, to me is fundamentally a moral, political language, is useful to understand what we can call the current challenges to rights right now, because the current challenge is about dehumanizing certain groups of people. We see that in the opposition to migration and refugee rights. We see that in the anti-gay, anti-trans rights. We see that in war and conflict. The dehumanization of the other has barely changed. I mean, and that is not a backlash. That is the point that you mentioned, is a continuation of very old languages and in terms of the formulation of the dehumanization of others. But that also appears on something that Ella mentioned, which is about the question as it affects scholars, but we can also say it about journalists, right? That is about the dehumanizations of scholars or journalists, precisely because of where they stand or just because of what they cover. And that is a useful language to think about the challenges as many scholars have experienced, continue to experience, as we discuss. It is a question about rights. You can say it's about academic rights or freedom rights or speech rights, right? And it's incumbent upon us, and that's something that we at ICA going forward, it is about an obligation. It's about the duty of care for others who are experiencing very challenging circumstances around the world. And that, to me, is sort of a good infusing that approach with sort of a blend of the human rights, the traditional arguments, as well as the care, the philosophy of care and obligation, is an important for something that is very tangible in this room, in this association, not only in different parts around the world. Back to being moderator now. Any other questions? Yes, Ella.
I just wanted to respond to the last point about surveillance. I agree. I saw those signs around. Did make me also feel a little strange, and it was making me think a lot about. So one of the issues that happened at my university after COVID, maybe at many of your universities too, was a sense of we're going to record all our lectures now because we did it in COVID. We're just going to keep going. We're a university of the 21st century, and it's important that we show that we're kind of technologically literate. And in a way, I was thinking about that sort of as a scholar in the space and thinking about this combination of kind of the tech juggernaut here, like, get out of the way, it's going to roll you over. And kind of techno-optimism and sort of this technological progress, kind of digital society arguments, and also this sort of thing of risk governance, which I think is at play with institutions' use of surveillance, right? So that it doesn't matter what your values are, if there's a threat, whatever the threat is, we've got to get rid of that risk. And so I think when we were thinking about lecture recording, it was a lot of the same arguments, which is that certain conversations are not safe to be recorded, certain people cannot speak. And it was this sense of coming back to our values as a community, so duty of care, making space for scholarship and conversation, and making really strong arguments that the technology really becomes the tail that wags that dog then, right? So I think, I mean, I have no idea how one negotiates at a conference with institutional spaces, but I think it'd be wonderful if in the next ICAs that, you know, there's no cameras in the buildings.
I will bring this up to the executive committee. To discuss. I will talk to the president. So, I think we have time for one last sort of round of final remarks, if you have any. So, Gerard, you would like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and I think it is great that, I'll just go back to say that ICA has chosen this theme, and it seems that this kind of conversation in a way is one instalment of a quite complex but important set of agendas, and to think of how we take that through, and perhaps that last sort of theme of our obligations, right? What those obligations are that both enable the work of scholars, but also the work of our associations and our capabilities to provide the kind of spaces in which rights can be flourished and reimagined is incredibly important. And, you know, we've got a way to go, I think, yeah.
Thanks. John?
Just want to thank Silvio and also ICA at large about, you know, putting this idea or this problem forward of human rights. And I can see some of the questions, maybe many more that didn't get asked in this session or in other sessions, that, we need to really kind of think about in what way ICA is a human rights organization, or in ICA participates or partake in developing certain human rights sensibility, in the way that the more the organization and the training of scholars and over the years become more and more professionalized, right? This is such a professionally oriented association, for all the good reasons, all the right reasons, that we, to use the phrase again, we do not forget to recenter the humans, that we're all professionals, but the bottom line is we're all humans. So what sort of things that ICA could do more in the future to recenter the human? I mean, let's say, could we have reading groups, just wild ideas, during the conference? So, I don't know, so I think this opens up that gateway to it, which, I'm really happy, and thanks, Silvio, for putting this on. I know this is not the only important agenda in the world, but because it's such a good placeholder, what we call human rights or human obligations, from which we can do things more humanly together.
Yeah, thank you, Silvio, and thank you, panelists, and thank you, everyone, for a wonderful several days. I think one of the things that was striking me during the conversation we had in the Q&A is that one of the things I love about our subfield, our field, is that we often turn the lens on ourselves because we see ourselves as sites of cultural production as well. And I feel like we were doing that, and I would like to encourage us to keep doing that. So keep turning the lens, like use our own tools on our own selves. And the other thing that I really liked about this theme is that it's such a theme that gets us to engage with practitioners. And I just would like to see spaces increase for that even going forward in the future ICAs, because I think that we both benefit from those conversations, both groups.
Yeah, I'm here at this conference because of this theme. And the question for me, and this goes back to you, Silvio, is, all ICA, all conferences have themes. But the issue is this going to be an episodic thing? You have a theme this year, and the next year you're going to have another theme, and we forget about human rights? Or is there some way in which there could be more of a kind of lasting impact in some ways? I mean, for example, can you think of a scholarship for a student who writes a really good piece on communication in human rights, or something like that, yeah? So that there is some legacy from this particular conference that exists, right, for a while. So I think this is just the beginning, right? And I would like to see IC actually take this very seriously. This is not just a another conference theme, but it's much more vital to, you know, to our humanity as scholars, I think, right? And so that's my.
Thank you.
I've been coming to ICA for almost a decade now, and it's really exciting actually to see the shifts in the conversation. So I actually see the continuity in some ways because of next year's conference theme and then the Global South location for 2026, you know, and I think the locatedness of this particular conference has been, there's been a really strong link with the conference theme, and it's really, you know, positionality, geography is really meaningful, you know, and being in this place with its particular political history has really allowed us to illuminate some of the issues that have come up here, and really just I think one final comment would be around method. I think maybe a challenge around method is to remember that, you know, we often talk about scholars and citizens, but as scholars, we are also citizens. We are also members of communities. So coming back to your point about our own positionality, you know, to remember that and to think about ways to push our methods towards being more inclusive and pro-human rights.
Well, thank you. I think time is up. Please join me in thanking all the co-chairs of the conference theme for everything that you have done. Thank you.